So we have this issue then, and with regard to John's Gospels and the other three Gospels, right? You kind of alluded to that a little bit there. It's called the Synoptic problem, and John is kind of a guy on his own kind of deal. Can you kind of explain what's going on there and how maybe undesigned consequences can help us with regard to this issue?
Right. So there's two different things going on. The synoptic problem, which I like to call the synoptic puzzle, concerns which of Matthew, Mark, and Luke was written first and who's dependent on what. And undesigned coincidences are relevant to that. But I won't. I want to get to John. I want to get to talking about John. So I won't pause and talk about that. I have an entire PowerPoint on the synoptic puzzle and undesigned coincidences, which is cool in and of itself. But it is true that there's a lot of overlapping material in the synoptic gospels, whereas John's material tends to be unique. He has more unique material. In my forthcoming book, I call him the red-headed stepchild of gospel scholarship.
I feel so bad for John.
He looks different. He looks different, right? Oh, you don't need to. John can take care of himself, man. Anyway, but that he looks different. And people will say, why is everybody down on John? And I'll say, because he's different, And part of what's very interesting there is there's a kind of inconsistency in scholarship. On the one hand, they will make much of the idea that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not all independent of one another, that there's some kind of a dependence relationship there that's very difficult to work out exactly what it is. The most popular view is that Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke are both using Mark. So they're recognizing that their selection of material, especially their selection of material, and sometimes even their very wording is copied, okay, that they're not just totally independent. I think they are partially independent, even in similar incidents, but they're not. And if you come along and imply some kind of independence between them, you'll get kind of sneered at. Like, don't you understand that we scholars understand the synoptic gospels are not independent. But then when it comes to John, it's this amazing switcheroo. I have actually had a very famous scholar, Craig A. Evans, in a debate that I had with him 2 years ago. He said, I'm counting votes, and it's 3-1 against John. Now, my jaw just about dropped when he said that, because you don't get to count votes when they're not independent. I mean, this would be like if three people went into the voting booth at the same time and consulted with one another. Like, who are you going to vote for? I don't know. Who are you going to vote for, right? And then you said, oh, they all three, decided that this candidate stinks. It's like, well, they were, influencing each other, right? Yeah. Okay. So especially if we're talking about questions like material that John includes that the others don't include, or how Jesus sounds, the idiom, or what sayings we have, sayings of Jesus that are not in the others. Obviously, the other three gospels are influencing one another. And I think John is consciously supplementing. I believe he had access to at least some, if not all, of the synoptic gospels. I think he had read them. I mean, I'm going to just go that far and say that because his was the last to be written, he said, well, I'm not going to do the Garden of Gethsemane all over again. That's been done already. Okay. I'm going to do it different. I'm going to talk about something different, And so I think he had a very self-consciously supplementary goal. Okay. And I think that takes care of a lot of this, a lot of this concern that John is the only one. And once we also reject the argument from silence, and my husband, Tim, has a professional paper. This isn't even apropos of the Gospels, though it is relevant, on why the argument from silence is so bad, especially when it's used against testimony. I mean, there are arguments from silence that are good. Like, for example, I don't see a dragon in this room. That probably means that there is no dragon in this room. You could call that an argument from silence, right? The fact that I don't see a dragon. That's because dragons are extremely large, and I would probably see one if it were here. But I don't see a spider in this room. That's probably not a spider. That would be a very bad argument, right? Because spiders are very small.
Right.
Okay. And particularly if my husband walks
so
in and
we would expect you to see the dragon if it was there. We wouldn't necessarily expect you to see the spider.
That's exactly right.
Unless if it's a spider dragon.
Now, if my husband, all the more so, if my husband walks into the room and he says, oh my goodness, there's a spider over there. And I say, I don't even look, I say, no, there isn't. I didn't see it when I came in. Okay, so what am I doing? Now I'm using the argument from silence against someone's testimony. And so when John testifies that Jesus, for example, said, before Abraham was, I am, he's the only one who does it. And the skeptic scholar Bart Ehrman will go on and on and on. Why isn't that in the Synoptics? If he really said it, why isn't it in the Synoptics? So what's he doing? He's using the argument from silence against testimony. Because John records it. It's like, well, John records it.
Right.
Why didn't they record it? Well, John records it. You mean everything has to be recorded twice?
Yeah.
Where's that rule coming from? My goodness, if you required that, we'd have very little history left. It's just not true that everything has to be recorded twice.
So your theory is that John, who wrote last, right, was familiar, read maybe even the other Gospels, and he deliberately and consciously decided to add things that they didn't have.
I think so. Yeah. And to not restate the only miracle that is in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. And he does have additional material about it. But most of his miracles, I believe all his other miracles are unique. And you can see him. Why didn't they tell about this? Oh man, I got to be sure to write that. I want people to hear that story.
Yeah.
So then it would be, given that, it would seem like it would be rather difficult to find undesigned coincidences with regard to John and the Synoptics, right?
And yet we have more of them in John than in any other gospel. It's astonishing, because what this shows is that you don't necessarily have to have them telling the same incident. Now, I gave an example of that a little bit ago when I gave the business about the cleansing of the temple having an undesigned coincidence with the Beelzebub controversy. Who would have thought? I mean, isn't that just beautiful? That you can have these undesigned coincidences. Or, for example, when Jesus says on the night, so they all tell about the night of the Last Supper in some form, but they don't tell the same things about it. So Jesus says, I am among you as the one who serves. He says that in Luke. They have been fighting about who's going to be the greatest, which they did repeatedly, actually. And Jesus begins chiding them that whoever is greatest among you should be the servant of all. And he says, who is greater, the one who reclines at the table, because that's how they ate, they reclined, or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines? But I am among you as the one who serves. Now, if you just read Luke, you'd say, well, he is reclining at the table. What does he mean? He's among them as the one who serves. And if you stop to think about it, it's kind of odd. And in fact, Dr. Michael Licona has suggested that Luke moved the argument, the dispute over who will be the greatest to that evening. It didn't happen that evening. But when we go over to John, we find that he washed their feet. So now we have an idea of what he means by I am among you as one who serves. And you can imagine, John describes that foot washing, blow by blow. I think John had quite a visual memory. Yeah. He rose and he removed his outer garment and he girded himself and he took water, like blow by blow. And you can picture them all just kind of looking in silence. And then he sits down, and he says, okay, boys, let's take this from the top, because he's saying something similar to what he said to them before. And then he says, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, but it shall not be so among you. And then he concludes with, I am among you as the one who serves. So that's an example where they're telling two different things. Luke of the dispute, John of the foot washing. And yet, because John gives the new material, he's able to fit together like puzzle pieces with the Synoptics.
And we can understand, obviously, the Luke account now way much more as opposed to being puzzled about what Luke is talking about.
Right, exactly. They explain, they explain one another. We can even look at it as a kind of undesigned coincidence in the other direction, that the reason Jesus washed their feet that particular night was because they were fighting.
Yeah.
Like what gave rise to that? Why on that night? Well, because of this bickering. They wanted to do an object lesson, so they just really fit together extremely well. It's a very cool thing. We find the way I put it is the more John tells us, the more he is confirmed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I do like he's writing later, and so you have people that aren't named in the earlier ones, and they're named in John. It's like, well, maybe they've died, or we have to look at the history and say, persecution is still happening to this group of people, and just looking at the history within that first century, I think also helps explain that. I don't think Bart Ehrman deals with all that much, or he doesn't deal with it in an honest way.
I think some scholars, skeptical scholars in particular, will say that adding names is a sign of embellishment. So they'll say, well, if there are more names in John, then that means John is, he's just trying to make things more interesting. And we do find that in the Gnostic or the later Gospels, the non-canonical Gospels, like the infancy things that are made up. They'll name people, like, for example, they'll invent a midwife when Jesus was born and give her a name and that kind of thing. So that kind of embellishment does occur. But actually what's interesting is you do have this kind of scatter pattern, which I like. So it's, for example, in Mark that we hear about Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross. And he's only mentioned in Mark. Or Bartimaeus, for example. A lot of scholars think Mark was first. He's only named in Mark. And then Matthew tells us there were two blind men, and he doesn't name either of them. So it's kind of cool the way you get these interweaving patterns. And I like to say that we need to recover the notion of casualness and the casualness of what's called salient or, comes to mind of a given author, and how valuable that is to historicity. People tell you things just because they thought of them. How often do you notice that with your friends, right? They're not bringing something up for some heavy symbolic reason, but just because they happen to think of it. And I think we see that with names in the Gospels a lot.
Mm-hmm. Great.